relatively the party of the moneyed elite. And he thinks it's unseemly and politically incorrect for the president to have his own park. And so he orders Pennsylvania Avenue constructed to cut off the executive mansion from what turns into a public park. That's where the park comes from. In 1824, a friend of Jefferson and John Adams, George Washington, and Peter Lafayette comes to America at an old age for a grand reunion tour. He visits John Adams at Quincy, Massachusetts, where Adams is an old man, Lafayette is an old man. He's feted all over the nation, especially here in D.C. by President James Monroe, who he knew very well serving in Washington's army. And so this park is named at that time Lafayette Park. Many years later, early 1900s, 1902, 1903, these four statues are built at the corner. We talked about the Jackson statues from 1852, having to do with Union and the approach of the Civil War. These four statues had a symbolic purpose too. It's Lafayette, it's Rochambeau, the French general who helped Lafayette and Washington at Yorktown. It's Kosciuszko, a Polish aristocrat, and it's Baron von Steuben, a Prussian German-speaking aristocrat. They were all Europeans who came to America during the Revolution to help us gain our independence. And as America entered the world stage in the early 1900s, President Teddy Roosevelt is sending a great white fleet all around the world. He's negotiating peace with Japan and Russia. It was thought fitting as a symbol of America's newfound eminence to put statues of powerful foreign figures who helped out America in its past at the corners of the park. So that's how those statues come about. And they're beautiful statues in themselves, just to examine one by one if we had more time. Speaking of Jefferson, Sally Hemings, do you know the story? The corner house is that of Dolly Madison in her retirement after she left the White House as First Lady. As an old woman, she came here, had inherited that house from her husband, James Madison, and lived out her life there and became the social center of Washington. Very much like Susan Will Decatur had been the center of social Washington back in the day. Dolly Madison takes her place. But do you know the story, the amazing story of her servant and slave, Paul Jennings, the same fellow who helped save George Washington's portrait in 1814? Do you know the story of Paul Jennings in 1848, 36 years later? Paul Jennings was still a slave for the Madisons. He had several times asked for his freedom. He had been, if you've seen the show Downton Abbey, you know how the master of the house has a manservant who dresses him and washes him in the morning? It's so old world. That was Paul Jennings' role for James Madison until the end of Madison's life. He was the president's personal manservant. And he was never called a slave because he was so close to the Madisons. But Dolly Madison was famously broke as an old woman and couldn't afford to free him. But Paul Jennings, although his memoirs show, written in the Civil War, he had great affection for Dolly and James Madison, although they're slaves. Paul Jennings took quiet revenge, not so much on the Madisons, but on the system of slavery. In 1848, he quietly masterminded the largest slave escape in Washington, D.C. history.
Oh, the Pearl.
The Pearl, the ship the Pearl.
Oh.
After revolutions broke out in Europe at the time, and freedom was in the air, including in America among the slave population, dozens of slaves one night walked and rowed down to the Georgetown waterfront and got on board the ship the Pearl, with the plan being to sail down the Potomac and then up the Chesapeake and then get up into the free states where they'd be emancipated, New Jersey, New York, New England. That was the plan. A slave, however, betrayed them. He was ticked off at one of his fellow slaves who was boarding the boat, and he came back to Washington and he told the slave owner that his slave was trying to escape. The slave owner and his friends got a hold of a very fast boat, and they caught up with the Pearl at Point Lookout, where the Potomac turns into the Chesapeake, brought the slaves back into D.C., sold many of them into very hard slavery in the new cotton plantations in Alabama, the new states of Alabama and Texas. There were two women in particular who became a cause célèbre, two sisters who wound up there, two slave sisters who were brought back from their attempted escape. There's a statue of them in Old Town Alexandria, actually, on Duke Street, near the King Street Metro Station. Their names are escaping me. Edmondson sisters, is that it?
I think that's it.
I don't think they have that. Anyway,
Edmondson.
it's nice to look up that beautiful new statue. They were brought back. It was a cause célèbre among the abolitionists that they were going to be sold into slavery, maybe cotton plantation slavery. So their freedom was bought actually by well-wishers in other parts of the country.
Harriet Beecher Stowe and her brother, and they went to university.
Yes, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin got involved in this. And but that was though unsuccessful, that was the largest attempt at slave escape in D.C. And D.C. at the time, maybe a third of the population or more of blacks were free men who had bought their freedom, right, been given their freedom by the slave owners. They had a very large free slave population. This is 1848. But he was the slave of Dolly and James Madison.